right, everybody, welcome to day 9 of distance learning. Today we're going to talk about evidence for evolution, so basically what exists that supports this idea that evolution took place. So after today, you should be able to identify what evidence exists to support this idea. So we'll talk about 4 specifically. Differentiate between what homologous and analogous structures are and give some examples of each. Define vestigial structures and give an example, and summarize the evidence for evolution in whales. And I'll go through those in a minute. So common descent is this idea that at some point, all living things must have a common ancestor if we look way far back enough, right? If we look at tigers, panthers, and cheetahs, I'm sure we've been looking a lot at tigers lately, they have a common ancestor of cats, right? If we look even further back, we know that cats have a common ancestor with horse and dogs and bats. They're all mammals, right? If we look even further back, we're going to see that mammals are going to have a common ancestor with birds, alligators, and fish. And so ultimately, it suggests that at some point, if we look far and far back enough, there's a common ancestor that we have. So this is something called a phylogenetic tree. You don't need to memorize this, but a lot of times people see this image and they don't know what it's showing. And basically, it's just showing here, this is, let's say, where time is. And then off on these branches is where life started to differentiate, right? And then from there, it started to differentiate into all these other versions, okay? And it's just showing how things progressed, okay? Again, this is a similar, I'm going to erase that, but this is a similar idea. Life starts here. We get these things, offshoots over here. This was a long time ago. Again, this says 3.8 to 4 billion years ago. Then about 1 billion years ago, we got plants. About 60 million years ago, we started to get some animals, right? And so it shows that change. All right, so I've put 5 pieces of evidence here. We're not going to talk about molecular biology too much. We're going to talk about fossil records, homologous structures, vestigial structures, and comparative embryology, right? Those are the 4 things we're going to talk about mostly. So with fossils, we know that fossils that are deeper, as opposed to fossils that are closer to the surface of Earth or Earth's crust, we know that those fossils that are deeper are older, right? They were there first. And these fossils show a change over time. So we know if we're looking at a species and we find fossils of the same species, we can see how things have changed over time. We can sometimes see even transitional fossils that show the changes that occurred. So again, this is just giving you an idea with whales. I'll talk about whales a little bit more later, but you can see there's some transitional species from whales over here to all the way down here, whales in their present day form. Okay, and this is giving you kind of the same idea. We'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so similarities in embryology. So an embryo is when an organism first starts to develop, right? So egg and sperm have come together, fertilization took place, and then an embryo is going to start to develop. So what this means is many organisms early on, when they are an embryo, they look very similar, okay? Now, does that mean that a human embryo and a fish embryo are exactly identical? No. I said similar. They are showing similarities, and so it makes it difficult to differentiate in the beginning in those early embryonic stages. So this image here, if we look at the top, we can see that these look pretty similar. I don't know which one's which. If I were to cover the bottom part of the screen, I wouldn't know. As they develop, so as they start to progress over here and then get over here, then we start to see differentiation take place. Then we actually start to see like, oh, this actually does look like a fish. Oh, this does look like a salamander. Oh, this does look like a chicken. This does look like a pig. This does look like a human, right? So you start to see that change, right? And so that suggests, again, if you're like, so they're not identical, but they start off looking the same. Yeah, because all of those animals have DNA, right? So we know that we have a certain percentage of DNA in common with other organisms. Now, it varies from organism to organism, but we know that that's the basic foundation. And then later on, when that animal develops, then certain parts of DNA turn on that cause certain traits that are characteristic of that animal to occur, like to have a beak or to have fins or something like that. All right, again, talking about patterns that we see with embryology, we're noticing that there's some things happening in the same order. And so that's giving us an idea that at some point, all of those organisms must have shared a common ancestor. Okay, homologous and analogous structures. Homologous structures are structures or things that share the same structure but have a different function. Okay, analogous structures are kind of flipped. It's the same function but a different structure. So an analogous structure would be something like a bat wing and a fly wing. Both of those wings are meant for flight, so they have the same function. But the structure of those wings between the bat and the fly is not the same, even though they're both wings. Okay? They don't suggest a common ancestor. Homologous structures and analogous structures, we'll get into those in a minute. So, homologous structures, this suggests at one point there was a common ancestor. So, if we look at, like we have here, we look at the human arm starts with a humerus. The cat leg starts with that humerus. Even the whale fin has that tiny humerus. Even the bat wing has that long, skinny humerus, right? And so all of these bones that are listed here, you don't have to memorize all of these, but they occur in the same order. Okay, so they are in the same order. They don't look the same. They might not have the same shape anymore. And that's because those organisms now have a different function, right? So a bat's wing has a different function than a whale fin. Right? They do two different things. So that's why those bones and those structures look different, even though they're in the same order. So this does suggest common ancestor among these organisms. Okay, here's an x-ray of a human foot. You can see the bones over here of the human foot. And on this side, you can see an elephant foot's x-rayed, and you can see those bones as well. And there's some similarities there. Okay, so again, same structure, different function. Those are homologous body structures. Okay. Analogous structures, again, same function, different structures. So in this example, I gave the example of bat wings, bird wings, butterfly wings. They all have the same function for flight, but they're not built the same way. So we know that it doesn't suggest that there's a common ancestor among those organisms. Okay, a vestigial structure is something that an organism once used at one point, but we don't really need it anymore. So in its current, in that organism, in their present form, they're not really using it. An example of this in humans would be the appendix. So we don't really have a purpose for it now, but we know that at one point in human evolutionary history, the appendix is thought to be related to what humans would eat. So whether it was eating raw meat or a high grassy diet, that's what they considered. And they thought it was related to that because of the location of the appendix, which is close to the large intestines, which has an idea of an additional process and step in digestion. Okay, another vestigial organ would be the pelvic bones of a whale. Now, your pelvis are your hip bones, right? That's where your legs connect to. That's because you need that pelvis to help you walk. Whales don't walk. So if you're like, well, why would they have that? They have that there because at one point in their past history, they needed to walk. They actually did move from land to water, which is weird because most life started in the water and moved to land. And we'll get to that in a minute. Vestigial organs, just one last one was just the tailbone in humans. That's it. I'm not going to get too in depth with that one. And so looking at the evolution, like we mentioned earlier with whales. So this is millions of years ago. So this is 10 million years ago. This is 50 million years ago. I just want to break this image down. This is what they looked like 50 million years ago. As time progressed, right, whales then were in the ocean, right? They were swimming. They didn't need a pelvic bone. They didn't need a pelvis because they weren't walking on land. And so we saw that structure kind of get smaller, smaller, smaller because it wasn't being used. And now we see that as a vestigial structure. So that is the end of that. I am hoping that this has helped you understand what evidence exists for evolution.